tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, so this is Saturday morning, and we're coming to session 2. And now we're going to sort of move into what you might call the, sorry for the vegetarians, but we call it the meat of the discussion. And this is the first major section in this chapter, chapter 7, the Compendium of Categories. And this is called the Compendium of the Unwholesome. And now before we get into this, the sort of basic method of the Abhidhamma mythology is to proceed from what we might call the scheme or the system of fundamental dhammas, foundational dhammas, the citta, chaitasikas, the material phenomena, and then use those ideas, those concepts, as tools for interpreting the terminology of the suttas, of the Buddha's discourses, in order to see what is the, let's call it the abstract system that underlies the exposition of the Dhamma that we find in the suttas. And so the commentaries sometimes make a distinction between two modes of teaching. I'll use the Pali words here. The word pariyaya, the original sense is something like turn around, turning around. And this, maybe we could explain it as the method of exposition, let us say the adapted method of exposition, the way in which the Buddha expounds the Dharma according to the mental dispositions, capacities, interests, expectations of the people that he's addressing. And so the Buddha will use a wide variety of methods of exposition according to the temperament, the mindset of the people that he's teaching. And so, for example, sometimes the Buddha will teach what is the path, the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Other places he'll say, what is the path? Moral discipline, meditation, wisdom. What is another place? What is the path? The 4 right efforts. So different methods, because the Buddha is speaking to different people in different situations. And he'll use different terminology, metaphors, similes, elaborations. Okay, but what underlies all of these different expositions is, this is according to the Abhidhamma viewpoint, what is we call the nipariyaya presentation. This is a presentation that is, we call it maybe the abstract presentation or the unadorned presentation. This is the presentation in terms of the fundamental principles. And the fundamental principles are what is set out in the Abhidhamma. And so the task for the Abhidhamma is to take all of the terms and concepts from the Pariyaya teaching, the teaching that's been adapted, varied, adorned to meet the needs and interests of the people being taught, and to show how this Pariyaya teaching springs from the underlying scheme or system in the abstract, and then to relate the Pariyaya teaching, the expository teaching, to relate it to the fundamental underlying groundwork, which is the abstract system. I use abstract not to mean that it's completely apart from experience, but this is the set of ideas stated without any adornment or adjustment to the needs of people being taught. And how this works, we're going to see as we go through this section. Okay, we start the compendium of the unwholesome with a group of defilements. What's meant by the unwholesome are the defilements. And so we start with a group of defilements that are called the asavas. So we have 4 asavas, as we see here. So the text says, in the compendium of the unwholesome, there are 4, here it's translated taints. I don't really like that word that much, but I adopted it from the English monk Bhikkhu Nyanamoli. So we have the taint of sensual desire, then something called bhavasava, which literally means the taint of existence, but it really means the taint of craving for existence or attachment to existence. Then we have the taint of views, particularly wrong views, and the taint of ignorance. Okay, the word that's being translated here is taint. The word asava comes from a root su, which means to flow. And a prefix a, which usually gives a sense of towards oneself or inward. So we say that the asavas are things that flow in. And so another alternative translation that I've actually been using more recently is influx, things that flow in. Actually, the text here says the word asava means literally that which flows out. There's been some controversy whether asava means flow out, but flow or to flow in. But my preferred understanding now is to flow in. So these are defilements that lie deep in the deepest stratum of the mind, and that flow up from that deep stratum into the mind, and we say they taint the mind. And then the commentaries say that the asavas are so called because they flow throughout all the realms of existence. They flow right up to the topmost, from the topmost, or they flow right up to the topmost plane of existence and continue to flow until one reaches the final goal of the teaching. And this term becomes especially important in the Buddha's teaching because when the Buddha is explaining the process of development culminating in liberation, he always or generally explains the experience of liberation as the release of the mind from the asavas. So he says, for example, as the disciple is contemplating the Four Noble Truths, his mind is liberated from the asava of sensual desire, liberated from the asava of craving for existence, liberated from the asava of ignorance. And so the goal of the Buddha's teaching, at least one way to express that goal, is asava kaya. The destruction of the asavas, and one who has reached the destruction of the asavas, that is, an arahat is described as keen asava, one whose asavas have been destroyed or eliminated. So the goal of Buddha's practice is, the ultimate goal is to liberate the mind from these 3 or 4 asavas. And the word asava was not completely original to Buddhism, because the Buddha, in his teaching, he would pick up terms that were being used in sometimes by the by the Brahmins, sometimes by other teachers of his period, and then give them new meanings that would be in accord with his own teaching. And so the Buddha picked up the word asava. It was used by the Jains. The Jains were a religious community or spiritual community that existed even long before the rise of Buddhism. And so the Jains used the word asava in one sense, in their own sense, but the Buddha picked up that word and gave it a new meaning, meaning these very fundamental, deeply rooted defilements which flow up into the mind and which can be said to flow out through the senses, out through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and the mental faculty. And in this way, they taint the mind. Okay, now I want to show how the Abhidhamma takes a set of concepts like the asavas and then relates them to its fundamental scheme of dhammas, of fundamental realities. So let's look at the text. We have here 4 asavas. So we start with the taint or asava of sensual desire. Now, where amongst the Chaitasikas are we going to, what amongst the Chaitasikas are we going to which Chaitasika are we going to relate the taint of sensual desire? We have the list of Chaitasikas on page 79. So we have the taint of sensual desire. So since this is the compendium of the unwholesome, it has to be one amongst the unwholesome factors. And so which one will it be? I think I heard it from... Right. Greed. The word lobha. The word lobha actually has many more or a much wider range of implications than the English word greed. It means any kind of self-centered desire. And so the asava of sensual desire is a mode or manifestation of this mental factor of greed. Then we have the second asava, the taint of attachment to existence. Which Chaitasika mental factor will this be a manifestation of? No. Craving for existence, attachment to existence, what mental factor? Say again? No. I thought I heard it. Yes. They're not mutually, the asavas are not all mutually exclusive. So both the asava of sensual desire, the asava of craving for existence, they're both modes or manifestations of the mental factor of greed. So greed is differentiated here according to its object. So when it's greed for the enjoyment of sense pleasures, pleasures through the senses, then it's called the asava of sensual desire. When the greed manifests as the craving for existence, then it becomes when greed manifests as the craving for existence, then it's a mode of the... I'm sorry, let me just get this straight. Okay, when there is the asava of craving for, when greed is directed towards renewed existence, the desire to continue in existence, to take on new forms of existence, then that greed is described as the asava of craving for existence. Okay, then we have the asava of, or the asava of wrong views. So where amongst the unwholesome factors do we find this asava? Which? Right, exactly. It's self-explanatory. And then we have the asava of ignorance. And what is that amongst the unwholesome mental factors? Right, delusion. So you see we have here 3 mental factors which turn into 4 asavas. One mental factor of greed takes on 2 manifestations. The asava of sensual desire, the asava of craving for existence. Then the one mental factor of wrong view becomes the asava of wrong view. and the mental factor of delusion is identical with ignorance. Okay, we need the projector now. Jason? Who knows how to turn on the projector? It seems like the light is on. Oh, okay, here. Okay, that's good. Okay, anyway. While it's warming up, we can just go to the next. Oh, here we are. Okay. Yeah, these are the canonical definitions of the four asavas. So I think it's very clear just from looking at the screen what's meant, right? Oh, I'm sorry. So this is what makes the study of these texts very, very convenient, is that they give very clear, straightforward definitions of what is meant. So it gives the definition here, what is the asava of sensuality or sensual desire? That which, in regard to sensual objects, is sensual desire, sensual lust, sensual delight, sensual craving. Then it gives a variety of other words. This is called the asava of sensuality. Then what is the asava of existence? In regard to states of existence, that which is desire for existence, lust for existence, delight in existence, craving for existence, this is called the asava of existence. Then what is the asava of views? Then it gives a variety. These were some of the views that were prevalent during the Buddha's time, the views that were held by the non-Buddhist ascetics, that the world is eternal, the world is not eternal, the world is finite, the world is infinite, the soul and the body are the same, the soul and the body are different, the Tathagata, or the enlightened one, exists after death, doesn't exist after death, both exist, doesn't exist after death, neither exists nor does not exist after death. Any such view is called the asava of views. So these are some of the views that were held during the Buddha's time, but we could understand the asava views to apply to any kind of wrong or misleading view. But an interesting question that comes up, can this asava of views also apply to Buddhist views? What do you think? It seems that the Buddhist texts, not the Buddhist discourses, but sort of the later texts, always take the attitude that the clinging to views or grasping of views always applies to outside views. But from my my own experience, having lived in a Buddhist country for 20 years, I've seen and also lived in monasteries of different Buddhist traditions. I've seen that the grasping of views and attachment to views also applies to Buddha's views. So there's a distinction, I would say, between attitude and content. So it's really being sort of attacked here, or homed in on, is the attitude of the grasping of views and that attachment to views. So somebody can take the view that everything is impermanent. If you say that, you're wrong. If you say anything else, you're wrong. Or there's no such thing as a self. It's just a myth, just a delusion. If they do that with a kind of fierce attitude of self-assertion and grasping, though they're speaking Buddha's views, but I'd say it's still the mental factor of ditthi, of view. Okay, the next couple of categories. Okay, we have a group called the Four We have a group here called the Four Floods. And look at the four floods. What are they? The flood of sensual desire, the flood of attachment to existence, the flood of wrong views, the flood of ignorance. Then we turn the page, we look at the next group, and we have something called the Four Yogas, which is not referring to, is it Iyengar yoga? What is the one that you do again? But it's the word yoga is closely related to the English word yoke. That was sort of binds one or ties one down. So we can translate it as the four bonds. And what are the four bonds? The bond of sensual desire, the bond of attachment to existence, the bond of wrong views, and the bond of ignorance. So you can see that the four floods and the four yokes, exactly the same as the four asavas. So this is what I mean by when the Buddha, we say that the teaching in the suttas is pariyaya discourse. The Buddha takes the same four factors and he just uses different designations for them because of he understands the mental tendencies of the people that he's addressing. So certain words will have an impact on people, whereas different words will have an impact on other people. So the Buddha changes the terminology according to the inclinations, the capacities of the people being taught. And like the word floods is especially pregnant with meaning in India, because India is subject to a season called the monsoon. When torrential rains fall, this is a period usually from middle of July to middle of October, when torrential rains fall and then the rivers get inundated with water and overflow their banks. And so travel during that period becomes very difficult. And many villages which are located near rivers, if the river overflows, they get swept away by the flood, torrential floods. And so the Buddha can pick up this as a natural metaphor to use for the defilements, just as villages and people and property is swept away by a flood during the monsoon season, so our minds get flooded with these particular defilements and swept away. And then the idea of the yoke would also have been quite common in an agricultural society of the Buddha's time. Oh, I didn't explain or give the explanation of avijjasava, the asava of ignorance. So what is meant by ignorance here? It's not lack of education, but it is defined as non-knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, not non-knowledge of suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path. Then not non-knowledge about the past, about the future, about the past and future combined, and non-knowledge about dependent origination. Okay, now we come to the next. Maybe I'll just ask whether there's any questions about the asavas, floods, or yokes.
Bhatteji, I have difficulty understanding.
It's good to stand up when you're asking the question.
I have difficulty understanding the asava of ignorance with the chetakas of delusion. How delusion is related with ignorance. How asava of ignorance is related with chetakas of delusion.
Yeah, delusion simply means, moha means lack of understanding. It's not illusions, but delusion, which means not understanding things correctly, not understanding things as they really are. And that is the meaning of ignorance.
Hi, Bhante. With attachment to views, as you were saying that even in Buddhism you could be attached to your own views, and maybe, are you saying that the right way to approach is to keep an open mind? Is that what we're saying? Like, if we hear a different view, we should not just reject it and be so attached to our view?
I mean, that's one approach. But of course in Buddhism, we adopt what we call right view, right understanding. But if one has the right view or right understanding, one knows that all views are not self, not to be grasped as I or mine. And so one doesn't cling to the view, but one uses the view in order to develop the rest of the path.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. What is your name again?
Sorry. How should we...
It's good to stand up. Yeah.
How should we view the relationship between the taints, the asavas, and the unwholesome roots? For example, are they totally separate?
Okay, this is a good question. The relationship between the asavas and the unwholesome roots. Now we know the unwholesome roots are greed, hatred, and delusion. So we can see that the four asavas, of the four asavas, two of them are modes of greed, and ignorance is a mode of delusion. Hatred is an unwholesome root, but it's not an asava. The reason it's not an asava, this isn't explained anywhere in the commentaries, it's just my idea, that the asavas are the factors that keep one bound to samsara, to the cycle of birth and death. Now, hatred doesn't have that binding function that greed and ignorance have. So hatred is a motive for unwholesome, karma, a cause of unwholesome karma, which of course, that unwholesome karma will ripen and bring unpleasant results. But hatred itself doesn't attach one to the cycle of rebirths the way greed and ignorance do. Kim. And then we have to go on. Wait, do you have to take the microphone? Stand up.
Yes, so Bhante, taints and floods and bonds are exactly the same as far as degree of severity?
There's not a degree of severity. They're just three terms for the same factors. Usually the Buddha expounds, when the Buddha expounds his teaching, he usually uses the asavas. That's the primary group. But sometimes, according to the disposition of the people that he's teaching, he'll speak of floods. Particularly when he's speaking more metaphorically, he'll use the expression floods and yokes. Okay, now we have to go on. Let's see how we're doing time-wise. Okay, the next set is called the bodily knots, kaya ganta. And again, the word knot, this is not like the kind of knot that one ties, not N-O-T, but K-N-O-T. The word knot was also used before the arising of Buddhism. The Jains also had used the word knot. In fact, they described themselves as the word for knot is ganta, and the Jains describe themselves or their monks as niganta, those who are freed from the knots, those who are without knots. And so the Buddha speaks of 4 knots. So we have here the bodily knot. Here we use the English word, a rather awkward word, covetousness. But maybe we call this strong desire. The knot of strong desire, almost the same as craving. Then the bodily knot of ill will. The bodily knot of adherence, here it's translated adherence to rites and ceremonies. I don't like this translation, but that's what it says. And the bodily knot of the dogmatic belief that this alone is the truth. Okay, we have the bodily knot of covetousness. Okay, this is the way it's defined in the text. The text that I've pasted in here is called the Dhamma Sangani. It's the first book of the Abhidhamma Pitaka, the actual canonical Abhidhamma text. So it speaks of, or defines, the bodily knot. It says, what is the bodily knot of covetousness? Then it says, that which is lust, passion, inclination, attraction, delight and lust, desire for forms, sounds, odors, taste, tactile objects, for gain, for wealth, for sons. India, they always prefer sons, I'm sorry to say. The desire for life, craving for sense pleasures, craving for existence, craving for non-existence, craving for forms, various types of craving, and so on and so on. This is called the bodily knot of covetousness. Okay, then what is the bodily knot of ill will? then the text explains various ways in which something called agato, resentment, arises. We don't have to go through all of these ways, but some of the terms used for ill will would be resentment, aversion, opposition, irritation, annoyance, anger, getting angry, hatred, hating, ill will, ferocity, displeasure, and so on. So this is the bodily knot of ill will. Okay, now this is the interesting one, where you'll see why I don't like the translation. So what is the bodily knot of, here it's called adherence to rites and ceremonies. So in the case of ascetics and Brahmins outside of here, the view that purity comes through good behavior, that purity comes through observances, that purity comes through good behavior, particular type of behavior and observances, such a view is called the bodily knot of adherence to, I would translate this, good behavior and observances. And this is referring specifically to something that was widespread in India during the Buddha's time, and we still find it in India today. This is the idea that one can achieve liberation through certain types of ascetic practices. And so we find in a sutta, this would be Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 57, there is an ascetic comes to the Buddha who is an observer of what is called the dog practice. That is, this ascetic thinks the way to enlightenment and liberation is to behave just like a dog. So he crawls on all four limbs, probably he barks, and he might go on alms round from door to door, and people will put out a dish of food, and on all four he'll go down and eat it with his mouth. And so that was the belief among some that this is the way to purify the defilements by behaving like a dog. And there would be the belief that the way to purity is to undertake long fasts or to stand on one leg for weeks on end. In fact, in India, there are still ascetics who undertake that practice. Or to go naked, to reject all clothing. But it might also include the belief that purity can be achieved through certain rites and rituals. That might be included here. Like the idea that if you come, say, to the Brahmin or to the Buddhist monk, he recites certain blessings and chants for you, and then sprinkles water over you, and that it's going to clean off one's unwholesome karma. Also in India, the belief, it's very widespread today, that when you go to the Ganges river and bathe, it cleans away all of one's defilements. So these would be examples of Silabbata Paramasa, the clinging to rites and ceremonies or to behavior and observances. Okay, then we have the bodily knot of adherence. How do we have it translated here? The bodily knot of dogmatic belief that this alone is the truth. And so here we have the case where again it cites these views that were prevalent in the Buddha's time, that the world is eternal. This alone is truth. Anything else is false. But somebody else says the world is not eternal, the world is finite, infinite. All of these different views adopted with the attitude, this alone is the truth. That's why I call it dogmatic belief, dogmatic insistence. This alone is the truth. Anything else is false. Okay, so now we come to the test of relating the four knots to the fundamental dhammas. So how do we go about doing this? We have the bodily knot of covetousness, or also we could call it the bodily knot of craving. How do we relate this to the mental factors? What is it? Exactly, greed. Then the bodily knot of ill will, I already gave it away when I read the definition. What is it? Hatred, a manifestation of hatred. And then we have, this might be a little subtle, the bodily knot of adherence to rites and ceremonies or behavior and observances. Exactly, wrong view. It's a type of view. The view that purity or liberation can be achieved through these particular practices. And then the bodily knot of the dogmatic belief, this alone is the truth. Again, wrong view. So here we have three mental factors, three unwholesome mental factors: greed, hatred, and then two representing wrong view. Okay, then we come to the clingings, four types of clinging. So the text tells us, okay, what are the four types of clinging? Now I'm at the top of page 267. Does that agree with your version? Okay, so we have four clingings. Clinging to sensual pleasures, clinging to wrong views, clinging to rites, and again this is sila bhatta, here rites and ceremonies, but we could also translate clinging to certain types of behavior and observances with the belief that they'll lead to liberation. And then the fourth is clinging to a doctrine of self. Okay, the definitions of the first three are already fairly obvious. So we have, what is the clinging to sensual pleasures? That which is in regard to sensual pleasures, sensual desire, sensual lust, sensual delight, sensual craving, and so on. This is called clinging to sensual pleasures. Then what is the clinging to views? Here a particular view is given, which is the view that denies that there's any kind of distinction between good and bad deeds, meritorious karma and unwholesome karma. So this is the view that there's nothing given, no practice of charity, no merit in making offerings, no result of good and bad deeds, that there is, this world doesn't exist, the other world doesn't exist. So this is the example of clinging to views. And we could put here, actually, all other views And again, I would say that under clinging to views, we could also put the clinging to Buddhist views as well. If the Buddhist views are adopted with this attitude of grasping with the mind and identifying with those views, this is my view. This is the view of my teaching. And then one holds it fiercely and insists this alone is truth, then it becomes a clinging to views. But if one adopts the right view, like the Buddha says, in fact he says in the Majjhima Nikaya, even this right view, which is pure and wholesome, you should not grasp, should not fondle, should not cling to, but you use it for crossing the stream. Use it to go from the near shore to the far shore. Okay, then the fourth type of clinging is explained in the text. It uses the formula for what is called Sakkaya Ditthi, which means the view of a self existing in relation to the five aggregates. And so, as you know, we have the five aggregates. And then in regard to these five aggregates, there are four possibilities, four ways of relating the self to them. Identical as the owner, so, for example, in regard to material form, one can regard the self as identical with material form. I am the body. Or one can regard the self as the owner or possessor of material form. The self is one thing, the body is another, but the self is the owner and material form belongs to the self. A third possibility is to see the self as inside material form, that the body, the self is somewhere within the body. Like some of the Brahman speculations say that the self dwells deep within the heart. The innermost core of the heart is a very subtle space in which the self exists. And then the fourth possibility is to see the self as being vast and all-encompassing, and everything else is within the self. So then material form, the body, is in the self. And then these same four possibilities can apply to each of the other aggregates. And so we get 20 views of self in relation to the five aggregates. So that is what is meant by the clinging to a doctrine of self, adopting any of these views regarding a self as some kind of substantial reality existing in relation to the five aggregates. Okay, now let's see how do we relate these to the different types to mental factors. So we have clinging to sense pleasures. Where amongst the mental factors is this? Right, it's a mode of greed. Clinging to wrong views, self-evident, this is wrong view. Clinging to rites and ceremonies or behavior and observances, wrong view. And clinging to a doctrine of self, wrong view. Okay, he's asking whether it can be delusion. This is where the word delusion is a little misleading, because delusion suggests something that one has like a positive formulation of, but delusion is really not understanding clearly. So it's not, the doctrine of self is not itself a mode of delusion, but delusion or ignorance underlies all of the other defilements. And so ignorance underlies that view of self, but the view of self is a manifestation of wrong view. And so we have two mental factors which are distributed into four types of clinging. One type of clinging is a manifestation of greed. The other three are manifestations or modes of wrong view. Okay, we have a couple of minutes for any quick questions. Ravi and okay, we take this young man first, then Ravi. Somebody will go. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a question in regard to the third bodily knot. Can you clarify the difference between clinging to a ceremony and observing a ceremony?
Clinging to ceremony and observing ceremony? No, I didn't make any distinction of that. I said that the word that's translated here, the word vata, which is translated here ceremony, I would translate it as observances. The real meaning is an observance that one undertakes through a vow, and it's usually referring to some type of ascetic practice. Okay, Ravi, right here, third row.
Thank you, Bhante. Bhante, my question is this, Bhante. Now, when it comes to view, samadhi, the right view is fundamentally important.
Yeah.
For instance, I personally feel...
You have to speak more loudly.
I personally feel the concept of impermanence
is
something that is that I accept, and which is very fundamental to me. And this confidence I have, but I don't consider it a clinging, because in case, you see, also it's stated in Buddhism that
I have to ask people to state a question precisely.
Right.
State your question.
Yeah. In Buddhism, we talk of samadhi.
Yeah.
And in addition, we talk of confidence in the Dhamma.
Yeah.
Which would be the what they call what's the term they use?
You're not stating a question.
Yeah. confidence in the Dhamma, that is, so
Yeah.
where does it, I know there should not be clinging, no doubt.
Yeah, the simple point is that, okay, the truth of impermanence,
Yeah.
one accepts it, that is right view.
Right.
But what I'm saying is that if one clings to this and sort of identifies with it and says, this alone is truth, and so uses it sort of to knock down other people,
No, I know.
then it's the same kind of attitude that underlies,
Yeah. Because the word Saddha is used very often as an important part
yeah.
of,
Yeah.
so where does Saddha and clinging, you know,
Okay, this is a bigger question. Maybe save this for the evening
Yeah,
discussion.
okay.
Yeah.
thank you.
I just want simple questions because we have to go on break. One last question right there. The question should be stated simply and clearly.
Bhante, this question is with regards to the previous sections.
With regard to?
The defilement of the tent or attachment to existence.
Yeah.
So once we start existing, like we are born, after that, if today we fall sick, we strive to get better.
Yeah,
So-
that is natural, yeah.
Yeah. So is this attachment after we die, or could you help us understand this better?
Yeah, I would understand this to be what's meant by existence here is a concrete state of individual existence. So the way this is understood is the craving to obtain some other form of existence after passing away, the craving to be reborn, especially in the celestial realms, the heavenly realms, or in the higher divine realms. So that is the craving
Okay,
for
thanks.
existence. Or to come back in the human realm and become rich and famous. Okay, we'll take a break now. I think we have, is it a 20-minute break? Right, up till 10:20. And I think a few minutes before we start, a bell will ring. Listen for the bell. I didn't really take very much.